When I was in rabbinical school, I took a class on community organizing for rabbis and cantors taught by a talented organizer named Meir Lincoln. In the course, there was one unit that before we even started it, Meir said, "This is going to be the hardest part for you." The unit was on power. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. described power as the ability to achieve purpose and the strength required to bring about social, political, and economic change. Activist and trainer Olivia Chow writes, "Organizing is about power, who has it, who doesn't, and how to build enough of it to shift power relationships and bring about change." In order to become a community organizer, one has to get good at talking about power. And for the Jews, that's hard. We have a complicated relationship with power. So much of anti-Semitism centers around the accusation that Jews hold supernatural power, which we wield in nefarious ways. And whenever a Jewish person finds themselves in a position of power, this only serves as a confirmation of the anti-Semites' suspicions. Much of the work that our teacher Meir had to do was to help us unpack our own internalized anti-Semitism, our fears and misestimations about our own power. To this day, it's hard for me to talk about power without getting a pit in my stomach. But Meir taught me that power exercised justly and in the pursuit of equality is never something to be ashamed of. So tonight I want to tell you two stories about Jews exercising their power, one from the Torah and one from right here in Texas. I hope they can be enlightening and empowering to all of us as we think about how we go about making change in the world. Our first story of the exercise of power comes from this week's Torah portion, Pinchas, where we learn the story of the daughters of Tzelofehad, who were named Machla, Noah, Holga, Milcah, and Tirzah. Tzelofehad had no sons, and according to the Israelite law, hereditary holdings passed down through only the male line. The five sisters see that this is unfair. Why can't they inherit their father's land? So they go to Moses. "Let not our father's name be lost to his clan just because he had no son. Give us a holding amongst our father's kinsmen." Moses is moved by their case, and he brings it directly to God. And God responds, "The plea of Tzelofehad's daughters is just," and instructs Moses to grant their request. But God does not just create an exception for this family. God goes further, amending the entire law, allowing for all daughters to inherit in the case where there are no male children. The daughters of Tzelofehad have mustered their power and used it to make a change that will help all future Israelite women. Before they state their case to Moses, they preface it by saying, "Our father died in the wilderness. He is not of Korach's faction." They're calling back to the Parsha from 2 weeks ago when Korach, a rebel leader, challenged the authority of Moses. God was incensed by these rabble-rousers and opens the earth to swallow Korach and his delegation whole. This is a cautionary tale about power gone awry. And we'll talk in a minute about what makes Korach's approach different from the daughters of Tzelofehad. But before we get there, I promised you a second story, a Texas story. Emmanuel is proud to be a part of the Religious Action Center of Texas. RAC is our movement's social justice arm, and Texas is one of 9 states that has a statewide project. This past spring was the 3rd legislative session in which we've been involved. Each session we have picked a piece of legislation to be our focus. This year we decided to build a campaign around HB 12, a bill to expand Medicaid coverage for women who've given birth for an additional 12 months. We chose this issue because it was a way to address our state's abysmal maternal mortality rate, which is 4.5 points higher than the national average. and the numbers are even worse for women of color. Supporting this bill was an expression of our movement's commitment to reproductive freedom. We believe that all reproductive choices are worthy of affirmation, and of course, this includes the decision to carry a pregnancy to term. Parenthood should not be a life sentence, and too often in Texas, it's a death sentence. HB 12 seeks to address this. According to a report released last year from the Texas Department of Health and Human Services, over 1/3 of maternal deaths occur between 43 days to 1 year after pregnancy. And around 90% of maternal deaths in Texas are preventable with quality health care. This bill will save countless lives. The bill is designed to draw down funds from the federal government, so it's a program that is free to Texans. A similar bill had passed in 2021 with broad bipartisan support, but it had only covered 6 months of Medicaid. And because it was not the full 12 months, and also because of some anti-abortion language that had been amended onto the bill, the federal government said that Texas didn't qualify. This is why we were back in 2023 to try for the full 12 months. Tzelofehad had 5 daughters. Our campaign was led by just 2 awesome women, our statewide organizer, Emily Bourgeois, and our state project chair, our very own Freddie Bleeker-Franks. Together with amazing committees that included many Emmanuel representatives, they coordinated a campaign that included targeted phone calls to vital committee votes and Senate testimonies submitted by 26 rabbis and cantors from across the state, including all 4 of your pulpit clergy. We were also a part of a much larger coalition led by Texans Care for Children, and we supported them in various ways. I am proud to say that because of the work that our coalition did, and because of the courageous leadership of a couple of members of the House and the Senate, the bill passed with broad bipartisan support. I'll take it. Let me tell you why you should clap for that. 10% of all births in the nation happen in Texas. And 50% of all births in Texas are covered by Medicaid, and that is why, with one bill, we were able to affect 5% of all births nationally. That's incredible. And I believe it was not exclusively RAC Texas, but I believe that RAC Texas' actions and powers were an inextricable part of getting this bill passed. Thinking about the intersections of these stories, Tzelofehad's daughters, Korach's rebellion, and the RAC Texas' HB 12 campaign, I'd like to offer 3 lessons that I think speak to how we might exercise power effectively in a way that makes positive change and keeps us from being swallowed whole. Lesson number 1, I call draw close. Jewish Theological Seminary professor Rachel Rosenthal notes that the stories of Korach and Tzelofehad's daughters each begin with a different verb. For Korach's gang, the Torah says, Ve'ikahalu, they assembled. Rosenthal says this implies the formation of a distinct renegade faction. In contrast, the Torah says of Tzelofehad's daughters, Vaitikravna, they came close. Rosenthal says that this demonstrates a desire to come closer to the rest of the community. Their approach is intended to be productive, improving the cohesion of the community, not oppositional. Both of these words are about how one positions their power in relation to the power of others. Korach presents his power in opposition to Moses. It is a battle from the start. But Tzelofehad's daughters know that they must build power amongst themselves, that they must also invite Moses to join them instead of setting themselves in opposition to him. I wonder if Ruth Bader Ginsburg was thinking of Tzelofehad's daughters when she said, "Fight for the things you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you." In RAC Texas, our first task of building power was to draw close to others in this work. This meant joining a diverse coalition that included everyone from, I kid you not, Planned Parenthood to Texas Right for Life, all of whom were committed to sharing power to bring about this change. And it meant drawing close to the people most affected by this bill, the women with the most important stories to tell. And it meant drawing close to the people in power, treating them as potential allies and not just obstacles to be overcome. There was a day when RAC Texas organized a series of calls every 10 minutes to 3 swing votes on a Senate committee. And over the course of the day, we got confirmation that at least 2 of them had come out in support of our bill. But still, the chair of the committee would not bring the bill up for a vote. We began planning to do another call-in day to pressure her specifically, but first, the coalition chair called the Speaker of the House. The Speaker hung up and called the chair of the committee, informing her that we knew we had the votes, and within hours, she brought it up for a final vote in her committee, where it passed unanimously. Because our committee had maintained a relationship with the Speaker's office, we could make that call. Sometimes the exercise of power means making hundreds of phone calls. Other times it means making one. Power lesson number 2, sometimes conflict is best avoided. According to Maimonides, the problem with Korach is that they are not actually seeking truth. They're just trying to open up conflict. Too often we conflate conflict with the effective exercise of power. After HB 12 passed out of the Senate committee, our coalition partners told us not to make calls to the entire Senate. The bill had broad bipartisan support, and it seemed likely that it would pass out of the Senate unless somebody on one far extreme or the other decided they could score political points by sinking our bill. We did not want to call attention to our bill and give someone the idea that it could be red meat for their base. We wanted to keep it vegan. So we had to wait, something that felt rather frustrating to most of us who'd been doing the work. It felt like we were doing nothing when, in fact, we were being strategic in our exercise of power. Sometimes power means the ability to act, but perhaps an even greater discipline is knowing when not to act. Power lesson number 3, beware of backsliding. In next week's Torah portion, just a few chapters after the victory of Tzelofehad's daughters, a group of their male relatives will come back to Moses to appeal the ruling. They will argue that the newly adjusted rules is not fair because what if a daughter who had inherited marries outside of the tribe, then the land would be transferred to her husband and her familial tribe's holding would shrink. God quickly works out a compromise. Women can inherit, but then they can't marry outside of their tribe. The compromise ends the debate, but it does so by curtailing the newly granted rights of the Israelite women. Something similar happened in our campaign. Once again, in the 11th hour in the Senate, anti-abortion language having nothing to do with the essence of the bill was added in. This threatened to once again disqualify us from the federal funds, which would keep the bill from being implemented, possibly forever. But this time, our committee was ready. We utilized the connections we had made in state and federal government to help behind the scenes in the conference committee as the House and Senate reconciled their versions of the bill. And the bill that came out, while it still contained some of the problematic language, was in a version that the federal government said they could accept. Backsliding happened, but in a way that didn't sink the bill or compromise the promise of saving mothers' lives. So these are the lessons of our Texas and Torah stories. Use your power with and not against people. Know when to speak, but also the power of silence. And remember that progress is often followed by backsliding. These lessons help us on the path towards harnessing our power for good. Our successful RAC Texas campaign reminded me that if we can silence those internalized voices that have taught us to be ashamed of our power, we can do incredible things. Like Machla and Noah and Holga and Milka and Tirza, like Emily and Freddie, we can fight for women's rights and equality. Reverend King once said that power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. May all these teachers inspire us to use our power to build a world of justice and love. Shabbat Shalom.